My wife left me believing I was broke, never knowing I was worth $500 million. 5 years later, she walked out again on the night I needed her most. The night my wife abandoned me for being penniless, Dallas rain lashed against tin like a grim judgment. She tossed divorce papers onto my chest, a fleeting kiss on our 5-year-old's forehead, then vanished into a Cadillac Escalade that wasn't ours. I retreated to my empty auto shop, where a stark envelope from a law firm awaited. Inside, an inheritance I never anticipated. $500 million from my estranged Uncle Henry. It arrived the same turbulent night, a secret known only to me. 5 years on, I am no longer the man she deserted. I'm a father who honored his word, a mechanic who built a future from grit, and a man finally embracing his true self. Then a taxi hums at my gate. She emerges, mascara streaked, suitcase rattling with an unmistakable weight of regret, pleading to return for our son's sake. Here's the hard-won truth. Money gauges what you possess. Character defines who you are. The gate vibrated softly. Would I unlock it? My name is David Miller, and for 2 decades my life reeked of engine oil and stale coffee. I wasn't born into privilege, just with a wrench in my hand and a Dallas mechanic's stubborn pride. My shop, a tin-roof structure on Elm and Jefferson, groaned with every storm. It was the kind of place where neighbors brought their old Fords and Chevys, hoping I could coax a few more miles from worn-out engines. I worked 16-hour days, grease ingrained in my nails, sweat pouring down my back, convinced that relentless effort would shield my family from hunger. The shop's walls absorbed my laughter, my frustrations, and the muted cries I never let my son hear. To the world, I was just another struggling man chasing overdue bills. To myself, I was a father holding the line. But holding that line exacted a price beyond money. It was slowly strangling my marriage, and I never saw the breaking point coming. At home, the atmosphere was colder than a Texas winter. Rebecca and I shared a bed but felt like strangers, separated by miles of silence. Our dinner table, more than our words, revealed the truth. Her fork tapping against fine china, my plate holding yesterday's leftovers. She yearned for rooftop gatherings, diamond jewelry, and Miami getaways. I prayed I could pay the mortgage before the bank called again. She often said my shop smelled of failure, that grease and sweat offered no future. Each time I wiped Ethan's small, grease-smudged hands after he helped me in the garage, I saw her eyes roll, as if teaching our boy honesty and hard work was beneath her. I kept assuring myself she'd eventually come around, that the tide would turn. But tides don't wait indefinitely. Rebecca had no patience. She was ravenous. Ravenous for status, for wealth, for a life that didn't include the man she'd married. And I was about to discover just how far she'd go. It was near midnight when the storm engulfed Dallas, rain drumming against my shop's roof like furious fists. My hands were black with oil from a stubborn Civic when my phone buzzed. Rebecca's name illuminated the screen with 4 stark words. We need to talk. I wiped my palms on a rag, my heart thudding louder than the thunder. It wasn't a request, it was a sentence. Driving home in my rusted Ford, the wipers shrieked across the windshield, battling the downpour. Every red light felt like an unheeded warning. When I pulled into the driveway, every lamp in the house blazed, an interrogation room ready. Her silhouette stood in the window, perfect hair, perfect dress, the kind of beauty wealth cultivates. I stepped inside, drenched, drained, clutching my keys like a shield. On the coffee table, an envelope lay in her manicured hands, and in her gaze, I saw the demise of everything I'd fought to preserve. She stood in our living room's center, an emerald dress clinging to her like armor, her perfume sharp enough to sting. In her hand, a thick manila envelope, final. Her eyes met mine with an unprecedented iciness. I married you for a future, not for poverty, she declared, each word a clean cut. You're a failure, David. I won't waste my youth here. I refuse to die poor by your side. The papers hit my chest with a slap louder than the storm outside, scattering across the hardwood like frightened birds. My throat constricted. I wanted to speak of my 16-hour shifts, of the dreams taped above my workbench, of Ethan asleep in his Superman pajamas, but no words came. She turned, heels clacking across the floor, drawers slamming shut as she packed. A chilling certainty settled over me. This wasn't an argument, it was an execution. Her voice pierced the thunder, as if years of resentment had finally broken free. You're a failure, David, she spat, the syllables sharp enough to tear me open. For a moment, the storm outside seemed to quiet. It was only my heart seizing in my chest. I'd spent 16-hour days at the shop, fingers cracked, back aching, holding the line for this family. To me, sacrifice was love. To her, it was proof I had already lost. Her eyes burned with contempt, not sorrow. In her mind, I wasn't just broke. I was broken. I tried to form words, promises that we were close, that tomorrow would be different, but my mouth felt wired shut. She didn't want comfort. She wanted escape. The rain intensified, as if applauding her verdict. And just when I thought the night couldn't deepen its cruelty, I heard the soft patter of bare feet down the hall. Ethan's small voice pierced the silence. "Mommy, where are you going?" His tiny figure appeared in the hallway, Superman pajamas sagging, a stuffed bear clutched tight. Ethan's eyes were wet, his lip quivering as he gazed at his mother. "Mommy, don't go," he sobbed, his voice fragile as glass. I instinctively bent, but his gaze was fixed on her, desperate, begging for something only she could provide. He tugged at the hem of her emerald dress with trembling fingers, like a drowning boy clinging to a life raft. For a flicker, I saw hesitation in Rebecca's eyes, a crack in her armor. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by that same cold resolve. She crouched, smoothing his hair with a brittle smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Be good for Daddy, Ethan," she whispered. "Mommy has a new life now." His sob struck me harder than any insult. And as she stood, her suitcase rattling across the wood like a final judgment, I knew the night had shattered more than just a marriage. The front door swung open, welcoming the storm. Headlights swept across the yard, stark white against the pouring rain. A black Cadillac Escalade idled at the curb, its engine purring like wealth itself. Through the tinted glass, the shadow of a man waited, silent, assured. Rebecca didn't glance back. Her suitcase thumped down the steps, wheels splashing through puddles, as if the house, the life, the family she was leaving were nothing but dead weight. She stepped into the headlights' glow, her emerald dress shimmering against the dark. I stood frozen, Ethan pressed against my leg, his tiny fingers gripping mine like a lifeline. "Why, Mommy?" he whispered, but she offered no reply. The Escalade door opened with a soft, reverent click, like a coffin lid. She climbed inside. The door closed. Taillights glowed red, then vanished into the wet darkness. And in that silence, broken only by the storm, my son's heart fractured loud enough for me to hear. The door clicked shut, the storm absorbed her, and a heavy silence pressed against the walls. I dropped to my knees, pulling Ethan into my arms. His small body shook, tears soaking my shirt, and I held him as if sheer will could mend both our broken hearts. The house felt cavernous, every lamp blazing, yet offering no warmth. Divorce papers lay scattered across the floor, pages curling in the puddles of rainwater that had seeped inside. The wall clocks ticking became unbearable, each second mocking promises I thought eternal. I whispered into Ethan's hair, "You're not alone. You'll never be alone." He clung tighter to his bear, his eyes closing from exhaustion, until he finally drifted into a restless sleep on my chest. Only then did I notice it, an unopened envelope on the table, emblazoned with urgent red letters. I believed I had lost everything tonight, or so I thought. When Ethan finally slept, I gently laid him on the couch and returned to the wreckage. My eyes settled again on the heavy white envelope, stamped Caldwell and Low Attorneys at Law. Urgent. My hands trembled as I tore it open. Inside, a letter that felt like fiction. My Uncle Henry Miller, eccentric and estranged, had passed away 3 weeks prior. With his death came an inheritance so immense I could barely comprehend it. Oil royalties, real estate portfolios, tech funds, totaling nearly $500 million. I reread the words twice, then a third time, waiting for the ink to blur into reality. $500 million. The very night I lost my wife, the world had bestowed a fortune upon me. But as my eyes scanned the fine print, one line cut deeper than all the others. Confidential for 12 months. Prove your spine before the world knows. I thought I'd lost everything. Instead, the real test had just begun. I stared at the letter until the words swam, my pulse pounding louder than the storm outside. $500 million, $500 million. It didn't feel like wealth. It felt like a crushing weight on my chest. How could a broke mechanic, a man clipping coupons for cereal, suddenly stand at the precipice of riches most only dream of? My initial instinct was denial. There had to be a mistake. Wrong David Miller, wrong address, wrong life. I held the paper to the light, as if truth would reveal itself through the fibers. But the seal was authentic, the signatures real, the numbers impossible to dispute. Shock curdled into fear. What would such immense wealth do to me? To Ethan? To those around us? I looked at my sleeping son, his small hand still clutching that worn teddy bear. One thing was clear. If I couldn't bear this secret with strength, I would lose far more than my marriage. The next page contained not numbers but rules. My uncle's words in that sharp, angular hand I remembered from childhood birthday cards. For 12 months you tell no one. Sudden wealth will test your spine. I want to see if you have one. I let the paper fall onto the table, rain hammering the windows like a dire warning. Keeping $500 million secret in a town where people noticed if you bought a new wrench. My wife had just left me because she thought I was broke. Now I had to maintain that pretense for an entire year. 12 months of silence. 12 months of grinding, toiling, proving myself before I could even claim the life-altering fortune detailed on those pages. I looked at Ethan asleep, his chest rising steadily against the storm. He was my anchor, my purpose. Could I carry this secret for him? Could I shield him while the weight of $500 million pressed down on my back? At the bottom of the will lay a folded note, separate from the legal documents. My uncle's handwriting was untidy but unmistakable. Danny, it began. He was the only one who ever called me that. Money is a loud friend and a cruel master. Don't chase the ones who leave you. Choose people who choose you. Most of all, choose your son. I read it twice, my throat tightening until I could barely swallow. Choose Ethan. Not wealth, not revenge. Not the woman who had walked out into the rain. Those words cut through the storm's noise, sharper than Rebecca's insults, heavier than the figures in the ledger. They were a compass thrust into my hand precisely when I needed it most. I bent down, brushed a curl from Ethan's forehead, and whispered a promise into the dark. I choose you, son, always. But making that choice meant embarking on a year of silence that could break us both. That night, as thunder rumbled across Dallas, I made a decision heavier than any fortune. I would raise Ethan alone. No matter the hardship, no matter the loneliness, he would never doubt that his father chose him above all else. The house echoed with Rebecca's absence, closets half empty, her perfume fading from the hall. But in Ethan's sleepy breath, I found my reason to persevere. I tucked him into bed, smoothed the sheets, and kissed his forehead with a silent vow. You'll never wonder if you're loved. Not ever. I promise. At dawn I returned to my shop. Same cracked concrete floor, same battered tools, same pervasive smell of gasoline. To my crew and customers, nothing had changed. They saw grease on my hands, sweat on my brow, bills stacked on my desk. They had no inkling of the $500 million secret locked within my chest. And so began the loneliest year of my life, pretending to be broke while learning to become whole. Morning arrived, bringing with it the relentless grind. I walked into my shop like any other day, the tin roof humming with residual rain, fluorescent lights buzzing above tired tools. My crew greeted me with grease-stained smiles, men who believed I was struggling just as they were. To the outside world I remained the broke mechanic on Elm Street, patching rusty trucks, haggling with suppliers, scrutinizing every dollar. Customers shook their heads at my long hours. Neighbors whispered that Rebecca had finally come to her senses, leaving a man with no future. I let them talk. Better they considered me poor than uncover the fortune I carried like a live wire in my chest. Every night I washed oil from my hands, tucked Ethan into bed, and stared at the unopened investment folders piling on my desk. $500 million lay hidden in the shadows. But to everyone else I was still just David Miller, the man barely clinging on. And that's precisely how it had to remain. By day, I smelled of motor oil and exhaustion. By night, I sat under a dim lamp, meticulously drafting plans no one could see. I registered a shell company under a nondescript name, Miller Holdings, bland enough to avoid suspicion. Its address was a rented P.O. box downtown. Through a trusted referral, I hired a discreet CFO, an older man with a banker's hands and a gift for absolute silence. We met in the back booth of a diner off I-35, paperwork spread between ketchup bottles and coffee mugs. He spoke in calm figures while I nodded, feigning comprehension, asking the same question repeatedly. No one finds out, right? He assured me that secrecy was our strongest asset. Funds flowed into holding accounts, structured so subtly that even my own reflection wouldn't recognize them. By sunrise, I was back in coveralls, tightening bolts on a Chevy. To my crew I was broke. To the world, invisible. But behind that unassuming facade, an empire was already taking root. The first thing I did with the money wasn't to buy a mansion or a new truck. It was to settle the debts that had suffocated me for years. Past due notices vanished from the mailbox. The mortgage was caught up. Credit cards ceased their incessant buzzing. Next came Ethan's schooling. I prepaid his tuition in quiet installments, slipping checks through the office window before the secretary could inquire. No fanfare, no explanations, just security for my boy. I even covered a year of counseling sessions, though I told him they were special talks to help him feel strong. But I never flaunted wealth. I still drove the same rusted Ford, still wore boots with worn-out soles, still packed leftover sandwiches in a brown paper bag. To my neighbors, I was simply scraping by, fixing cars to put cereal on the table. And that was perfectly acceptable. Flash attracts attention. Silence builds safety. Ethan didn't need a rich father. He needed a steadfast one. The nights were the most challenging. After 16 hours at the shop, I'd stumble home bone-tired, but Ethan's eyes always waited for me in the dark. He'd pad into the living room in his pajamas, teddy bear under one arm, and climb into my lap as if I were the last safe harbor in the world. I'd hold him close, the house too quiet without her laughter, though truthfully, it had been quiet long before she left. Outside, crickets chirped against the Dallas night, but inside I whispered into his hair, "Son, you will never go to sleep wondering if you're loved. Not ever. I promise." His small hand squeezed mine, and for a moment, the world shrunk to just the two of us on that worn couch. Then came the question I dreaded, his voice barely a whisper. "Daddy, will Mommy ever come back?" I swallowed hard, my heart cracking anew, knowing the storm wasn't truly over. While I was changing oil and eating cold sandwiches in Dallas, Rebecca was living her dream beneath Miami's neon glow. Victor Cole, slick suits and easy smile Escalade money, paraded her through penthouses with glass walls and champagne towers that shimmered like liquid gold. She wore diamond bracelets I couldn't even pronounce, posted sunsets from yachts I'd never set foot on. Her world appeared flawless. Caviar brunches, designer dresses, parties where laughter seemed too loud to be genuine. Friends congratulated her for trading up, whispering she'd escaped a broke mechanic's dead-end life. From the outside it was paradise. Yet, even through her meticulously curated smiles and photos, I detected a hunger in her eyes, the kind no ocean view could ever satiate. Because Victor's empire was built on shifting sand, leveraged and borrowed. She believed she'd found security. What she truly stepped into was a gilded cage. And cages, no matter how golden, inevitably crack. Back in Dallas, as Rebecca floated through champagne bubbles, I was laying a different kind of foundation. With my discreet CFO's assistance, I signed papers for a second shop. Nothing flashy. Just a dilapidated old garage off Jefferson Avenue that everyone else had dismissed. I scrubbed the floors myself, painted the walls white, and acquired 2 new lifts under the holding company's name to avoid scrutiny. My crew assumed I'd secured a small loan, perhaps called in a favor. They clapped me on the back, proud that the broke mechanic was finally getting a break. I let them believe it. Every bolt tightened, every paycheck issued, was a secret investment in something grander. I promised my team profit-sharing, health coverage, luxuries I knew too well were rare in our industry. To the neighborhood, it was simply another auto shop opening. But to me, it was proof that the empire Uncle Henry's fortune had seeded could grow in silence, one garage at a time. Within 2 years, Miller Holdings quietly owned 3 auto shops scattered across Dallas. Each one carried the familiar sense of motor oil and sweat, but also something rarer: security. I paid my mechanics more than any shop in the county. Christmas bonuses arrived early. Overtime wasn't swallowed by excuses. It appeared on checks. And for the first time, these men who had patched tires in the heat, bent their backs under rusty hoods, saw profit-sharing slips in their envelopes. They were no longer just employees, they were partners. Their children wore new shoes. Their wives stopped worrying about groceries. Every Friday I walked the floors, shaking hands, asking questions, listening more than talking. My name wasn't on billboards, but my people carried my reputation further than any ad campaign. Customers said, "That shop on Elm treats you fair. The new one on Jefferson fixes what others miss." Word was spreading, quietly but steadily, and with it came a question. How long could I keep this secret life hidden? One evening, Ethan came home from kindergarten, clutching a paper covered in bright crayon lines. He beamed with pride, holding it up for me to see. 3 stick figures stood under a sun with long yellow rays, 2 tall, 1 small. But on his page, only 2 figures were colored in. A boy with messy hair and a man with a cap smudged in blue. "Look, Dad," he said, smiling. "It's us." He didn't even mention the missing one. My throat tightened as I knelt beside him, nodding as if nothing hurt. I pinned the drawing on the fridge with a magnet, pretending my eyes weren't burning. Ethan smiled widely, happy that I was proud. His little hand tugged mine, pulling me toward the garage to help him tighten bolts on a toy car. The absence on that page spoke volumes, but his smile told me something more profound. He still believed 2 was enough, and I swore I'd spend my life proving him right. The drawing on my fridge haunted me, not for its presence but for its void. That's when I resolved that pain should construct, not merely demolish. I sat at my kitchen table, papers fanned out beneath the hum of a cheap lamp, and drafted the first charter for the Miller Foundation for Single Fathers. It wasn't about garnering headlines, it was about men like me. Those tucking children into bed alone, juggling bills, drowning in custody battles they couldn't afford. I earmarked a portion of my hidden fortune, funneled through the holding company, and by month's end, The foundation quietly paid legal fees for two fathers fighting to keep their children. No cameras, no ribbon cuttings, just quiet checks signed in the dark, lifelines extended where no one else was looking. Each story ignited a fire within me. And though I told no one, I knew if I was to keep my wealth secret, I could at least make my mercy resonate. The newspapers never printed a word. And that was precisely my preference. But in kitchens across Dallas, fathers wiped tears from their cheeks as eviction notices disappeared. Custody lawyers answered calls, and daycare bills were suddenly covered. I witnessed the difference in how their children moved, lighter, faster, laughing louder because the ground beneath them finally felt secure. On Sundays at church, no one knew I was the one who had kept a family intact that week. I shook hands like everyone else, nodding as men recounted how a miracle had arrived at just the right time. I smiled, never confessing that the miracle had passed through my checkbook first. To the world, I remained the broke mechanic with grease under his nails. But behind the curtain, families were breathing again because of the foundation. I wondered how long I could sustain this secret. How long before generosity left undeniable fingerprints. While I kept my head down in Dallas, Rebecca broadcast a vastly different narrative from Miami. Her social media glittered with snapshots of diamond bracelets, champagne towers, and sunlit yachts. Captions boasted of new beginnings and the life she supposedly deserved. To her followers she appeared untouchable, draped in wealth and confidence. But I knew better. Victor Cole's empire wasn't built on solid ground. It was a precarious stack of loans and leveraged deals, a house of cards awaiting the slightest breeze. Behind the marble lobbies and penthouse parties, creditors were already circling. Payments stalled. Calls arrived at inconvenient hours, which Victor muted with a smile too quick to be genuine. Rebecca disregarded the warning signs, too captivated by the sparkle. She believed the diamonds were eternal, but they were rented illusions. She had exchanged stability for spectacle, and though she hadn't yet perceived it, the cracks were spreading rapidly. Every dazzling post was one step closer to the inevitable collapse. Back in Dallas, while Rebecca clinked champagne glasses, I was hunched over spreadsheets after Ethan went to bed. My CFO slid documents across the table, and I studied them with the mechanic's patience, line by line, bolt by bolt. It wasn't chrome or horsepower that captured my attention but software. I quietly began investing in auto tech programs capable of predicting fleet repair needs, diagnostics that reduced downtime and saved companies millions. No glossy ads, no flashy headquarters, just gritty code solving expensive problems. To most it looked mundane. To me it looked inevitable. I poured capital into 2 startups and funded research for cleaner engines. The risk churned my stomach, but so did the thought of squandering Uncle Henry's fortune on vanity. I desired something enduring, something Ethan could be proud of. Every signature felt like tightening a bolt on a machine far vaster than I could see. If it ran, the payoff would be enormous. If it failed, no one but me would ever know. Among the companies I supported, one initially seemed almost laughable. A scrappy startup operating out of a converted warehouse, developing diagnostic software for fleet maintenance. No fancy lobby, no polished pitch deck. Just a team of engineers in hoodies who believed trucks could communicate if you only listened correctly. I signed a modest check, the kind of investment larger players overlooked. Months passed, updates trickled in, and then one night my CFO slid a new file across the table. The company had secured a national contract with a shipping giant. They weren't seeking more seed money. They were preparing for an IPO. I sat there stunned, my heart thudding as the numbers leaped off the page. My quiet stake, hidden like a secret, had multiplied beyond anything I'd imagined. The world was about to learn their name. But mine would remain hidden for now. While contracts and IPOs silently materialized in the background, my true work unfolded beneath the fluorescent hum of my shop. Ethan grew taller each month, his Superman pajamas replaced by overalls that hung loose on his slender frame. He'd follow me into the garage, dragging a stool so he could reach the workbench. I taught him how to grip a wrench, how to discern an engine's rhythm. Grease streaked across his cheeks like war paint, but he grinned as if he were constructing a rocket ship instead of tightening bolts on a rusty Ford. Sometimes he'd ask if Mommy ever fixed cars with me. I'd swallow the lump in my throat and reply, "No, son. This is our thing." And it was. Each stripped screw and tightened gasket became another stitch holding us together. He thought I was instructing him about engines, but what I was truly imparting was resilience, how to keep moving forward even when parts of you have been left behind. Even as my net worth swelled in accounts no one could trace, my daily life scarcely altered. I still drove that rusted Ford with its cracked dashboard and obstinate wipers. The engine coughed in the mornings, but I kept it alive with the same patience I applied to myself. Our small house's roof leaked during spring rains, So I climbed up with a bucket of tar instead of calling a contractor. Dinner often consisted of grilled cheese or leftover chili, eaten with Ethan at the kitchen table that bore more scratches than shine. Neighbors pitied me, shaking their heads at the poor mechanic raising a boy alone. They didn't see the shell companies, the expanding portfolio, the IPO shares quietly climbing in secure rooms. And I didn't correct them because modesty was more than a disguise. It was armor. If wealth proclaimed itself, it would attract predators. But silence allowed me to build undisturbed. And the world still had no idea what was brewing. 12 months passed in silence, each day a balancing act between grease-stained overalls and million-dollar decisions concealed behind closed doors. Then one morning my phone buzzed with a message from Harold Lowe, my uncle's attorney. "Mr. Miller, your confidentiality term has expired. You have the right to go public." I sat across from him in a walnut-paneled office, the same one where the will had fractured my life a year prior. Papers lay neatly stacked, signatures awaiting, cameras on standby should I choose to step into the light. Harold adjusted his glasses and inquired, "Do you want to reveal it now?" The weight of the question pressed on me harder than any wrench I'd ever wielded. Outside, traffic hummed, unaware that a mechanic could declare himself a multimillionaire with a single word. I thought of Ethan, of the men in my shops, of the families my foundation had silently uplifted. The world anticipated an announcement. What I said instead surprised even me. Harold slid the disclosure forms across the table, a pen waiting like a loaded gun. With one signature I could step into the spotlight. Interviews, headlines, handshakes from politicians who'd never acknowledged me before. My name could be printed beside millionaire, perhaps even billionaire. I stared at the ink, then pushed the papers back. "Not yet," I stated. Harold raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. Instead of facing cameras, I drove home to the steady hum of my shop. Instead of champagne, I drank black coffee under fluorescent lights. My life didn't require an audience. It required roots. Every bolt I tightened, every paycheck I signed, every father the foundation assisted was sufficient proof. Wealth might have been a secret, but purpose was not. I chose silence because silence afforded me control. The world would eventually discover, but on my timeline, not theirs. And fate, as always, was already orchestrating the next move. It unfolded on an ordinary afternoon, the kind that offers no hint of impending life change. I had gone downtown to observe a pro bono clinic my foundation discreetly supported, sitting in the back of a crowded courthouse hallway. That's where I first saw her, Sarah Johnson. She wasn't polished like the lawyers I'd known in Uncle Henry's world. Her sleeves were rolled, her bun half untangled, papers tucked under her arm. But when she stood before a judge, her voice resonated with steady steel. She argued passionately for a single father who had missed work to protect his child, making the law sound less like bureaucracy and more like compassion. When the session concluded, she laughed softly at something a client said, and the sound disarmed me. It was unrefined, genuine, alive. I didn't know then how profoundly she would impact me or Ethan, but I felt a faint, certain premonition. This was no coincidence. Sarah was unlike anyone I had ever encountered. She carried herself with a strength that required no jewelry to shine, with a kindness that felt utterly authentic. She listened more than she spoke, and when she did speak, people leaned closer, not out of deference to power but out of trust. She inquired about my work and I shared the truth, at least part of it. "I run a few auto shops," I confessed, wiping grease from my palms, embarrassed that I smelled of gasoline instead of cologne. She smiled and said, "That's honest work," as if it were the most valuable pursuit in the world. Sarah had no idea I presided over an empire. She knew nothing of the shell companies, the IPO shares, or the $500 million inheritance. And I had no intention of telling her because for the first time someone truly saw me. Not the fortune, just me. And that was more precarious and more precious than any secret I'd ever kept. One Saturday afternoon, Sarah stopped by the shop to drop off some paperwork for the foundation. Ethan was already there, perched on his stool, playing my apprentice. When he spotted her, his face lit up with a mischievous grin only a child can muster. "Miss Sarah," he announced proudly, "do you know how to change a tire?" She laughed, shaking her head. "Not a clue." He grabbed her hand, dragged her over to an old pickup, and began instructing her with a professor's gravity. "First, you loosen the lug nuts like this." Sarah knelt, fumbling with the wrench, grease smudging her fingers. Ethan patiently corrected her form with exaggerated gestures, and I couldn't help but chuckle. Soon, all three of us were doubled over in laughter. The boy who missed a mother, the woman who cared nothing for money, and the man still learning to truly breathe again. In that laughter I felt it. Something new was beginning. The more time I spent with Sarah, the more I understood her rarity. I had known women who measured life in diamonds, vacations, and bank balances. Sarah measured it in people, who was hurting, who needed help, who deserved an opportunity. She laughed with Ethan as if they'd known each other forever, never flinching at grease on her jeans or the lingering scent of motor oil. She didn't pretend to be perfect. If she was tired, she said so. If she disagreed, she spoke plainly. Her honesty cut sharper than any jewel, and it glowed brighter too. I found myself drawn to that light, not because she filled the void Rebecca left, but because she stood on her own, steady and unshaken. Watching her, I realized love didn't need to be adorned in emerald gowns and expensive perfume. Sometimes it came with rolled-up sleeves, laughter in a garage, and the quiet certainty that you were finally seen. 2 years later, beneath the sprawling branches of an ancient oak on the outskirts of Dallas, I married Sarah. The tree had weathered 100 storms, its roots deeply embedded in Texas soil, and it felt right that it should witness ours. There was no cathedral, no chandeliers, no emerald gowns, just close friends, a few shop workers, and Ethan, now 10 years old, standing proudly between us with a small velvet box. He handed us the rings with hands steadier than my own. When Sarah spoke her vows, her voice carried the same calm conviction I'd first heard in that courthouse hallway. She promised nothing glamorous, only honesty, loyalty, and a love that worked as tirelessly as I did. I slipped the ring onto her finger, kissed her beneath the oak, and for the first time since Rebecca walked away, I felt complete. But as the applause faded and we walked back down that grassy aisle, I knew this was more than a wedding. It was the true genesis of our family's story. Ethan walked toward us that morning with squared shoulders, the little velvet box carefully balanced in his hands. Sunlight filtered through the oak leaves, dancing across his face, and for a moment I saw both the boy clutching a teddy in the dark and the young man he was becoming. He stopped between us, looked up and grinned. "Here," he said, his voice steady. "Don't drop them." We all laughed, but his eyes shone with something deeper. Pride, relief, perhaps even healing. When Sarah took her ring from him, her hand brushed his cheek. It was the simplest gesture, but I watched my son lean into it as if he'd been waiting for years. And in that instant, I knew her love had already filled the empty space Rebecca left behind. We exchanged rings, pledged forever, and kissed beneath the oak while Ethan clapped like the happiest guest there. For the first time, our family felt truly whole. What began as a single garage in Dallas blossomed into something far grander than I could have ever envisioned. Within a few years, Miller Auto wasn't merely a neighborhood name. It spanned state lines with shops in Oklahoma, Arkansas, and beyond. Each establishment upheld the same core values: fair wages, honest work, and profit sharing for the dedicated men and women who kept the engines running. But I didn't stop at auto shops. I acquired a derelict vocational campus and reimagined it as the Miller Trades Academy, offering tuition-free education for veterans, single parents, and anyone seeking a second chance. On opening day, I walked the halls, hearing tools clatter and students laugh, and thought, this is what Uncle Henry meant when he said, build something that outlives you. Graduates emerged not burdened by debt, but equipped with valuable skills. Families ascended from poverty thanks to the steady paychecks that followed. And as the academy flourished, so did the whispers. People began to ask who was funding all this. The spotlight I'd assiduously avoided was gradually drawing closer. The Miller Foundation expanded beyond a lifeline for single fathers, evolving into something more extensive. We began sponsoring under-resourced schools, repairing leaky roofs, purchasing new computers, and stocking libraries with more than worn hand-me-downs. I'll never forget the radiant faces of a classroom of children when they saw boxes of fresh books with their names inscribed inside the covers. But education alone wasn't enough if parents couldn't secure employment. So we funded job programs, partnered with local businesses, and transformed vacant lots into training sites. Men and women who once relied on food banks were now punching clocks, earning wages sufficient to support their families. Every project bore my fingerprints but never my name. To the public, the funding came from anonymous donors. Yet rumors started to swirl. Who was behind this sudden wave of generosity? Reporters probed. Investors speculated. Politicians sought introductions. The world didn't yet know my face, but they were closing in. I didn't step into the spotlight, but somehow the spotlight found me. First, a local business journal published an article praising an anonymous investor reshaping Dallas. Then, a national magazine featured a piece on the quiet billionaire changing Texas. They never printed my name, but the label stuck. Reporters called my shops fishing for quotes. Politicians extended invitations with embossed seals, urging me to attend luncheons and charity galas. I politely declined them all. To the men in coveralls beside me, I was still just David, the guy who never minded grease under his nails. But the rumors intensified, and the storylines grew more outlandish. Some speculated I was a foreign tycoon hiding in plain sight. Others claimed I was laundering money through car shops. None guessed the truth, that I was simply a mechanic who inherited a fortune and chose to wield it quietly. But quiet couldn't last forever. And somewhere in Miami, Rebecca was about to hear the whispers too. While my shops prospered and the foundation expanded, Victor Cole's empire was crumbling from within. His grand construction projects had been financed by credit stacked higher than his glass towers. When payments faltered, banks ceased their smiles. When audits began, the laughter in his penthouse parties thinned to anxious whispers. I read in the business section that his company was under review. Behind those words lay the grim reality. Subpoenas delivered in manila envelopes, creditors circling like vultures, federal agents sifting through accounts that no longer balanced. Contracts evaporated. Investors withdrew. And Victor, who once boasted of owning the skyline, was now desperately scrambling just to keep the lights on. Rebecca, adorned in jewels she didn't own, sipping champagne poured on borrowed time, had no idea the ground was already disintegrating beneath her. Her dream of wealth wasn't built on love or stability. It was built on Victor's deceptions. And when he fell, she was destined to fall with him. When Victor's empire finally imploded, Rebecca's world collapsed alongside it. The penthouse doors that once swung open for her now locked her out. The Escalade vanished on the back of a tow truck. Jewelers who once implored her to try on bracelets now demanded outstanding balances. Initially, she called her friends, the women who had toasted her escape from poverty. But her calls went unanswered, her messages left unread. Without Victor's credit card swipes, she was no longer an honored guest, merely a reminder of unpaid bills. The parties dried up, the champagne stopped flowing, and her phone's silence became deafening. She had constructed her identity on borrowed luxury. And when the credit ran out, so did the applause. Rebecca wasn't just broke, she was alone. And for the first time, she couldn't laugh her way past the emptiness. She had left us for wealth. Now she possessed neither. It didn't take long for the bills to catch up. Creditors filed lawsuits, eviction papers slipped under the door, and Rebecca's penthouse paradise morphed into a tightening cage. She argued with Victor, but by then he was already disappearing into lawyers' offices and hushed meetings with federal agents. One morning, building security knocked. 2 men in suits, carrying papers that left no room for negotiation. She had 24 hours to vacate. The marble floors she'd once bragged about felt colder as she stuffed designer gowns into trash bags, trading diamond dreams for cardboard boxes. Neighbors watched as her belongings were hauled out, the same neighbors who used to envy her. No one offered help. No one offered a place to stay. By nightfall, Rebecca stood on the curb with nothing but a suitcase and the resonant echo of her own choices. Rebecca used to sweep through Miami lobbies, turning heads, the self-proclaimed queen of the parties. But when the money dried up, so did the smiles. Texts she once sent, champagne emojis, invites to rooftop dinners, now sat unanswered. Her name appeared on screens, and people let it ring until voicemail swallowed the sound. The concierge who once bowed when she entered now offered barely a nod. Waiters who used to rush to her table pretended not to see her. The women who had coveted her emerald dresses and diamond posts suddenly had other brunches to attend. She was still beautiful, still carried herself with the same poise, but without Victor's credit card and the shimmer of borrowed wealth, she was invisible. The queen of the parties discovered the cruel truth. A crown made of glass shatters the moment it hits the floor. And with no court left to admire her, Rebecca stood utterly alone, desperate and rapidly sinking. Neon buzzed over a pawn shop on a cracked Miami street, the kind of place Rebecca once swore she'd never enter. But hunger disregards pride. She pushed inside, heels scuffing against the worn tile, clutching the last bracelet Victor had given her. The clerk barely glanced up. He weighed the diamonds, scratched the metal, then quoted a number that sounded like an insult. Rebecca weakly protested, then fell silent when she noticed the sign taped to the counter. No haggling. She handed it over. Cash slid back across the glass. Enough for rent, perhaps groceries, but not enough to quiet the shame. As she stepped outside, she caught her reflection in the dusty window. The emerald dress was gone, replaced by a thrift store blouse. The woman staring back looked older, smaller, and for the first time, she whispered the truth she had buried for years. Walking away from her family had been the greatest mistake of her life. Rebecca was still clutching her crumpled cash when the sound of a television caught her ear. Mounted in the corner of the pawn shop, a flickering screen displayed the evening news. There I was, standing at a podium in Dallas, microphones angled toward me. The caption across the bottom read, "David Miller pledges $100 million to education." She froze, eyes wide, as if the air had been sucked from the room. The broke mechanic she'd left in the rain was now a man making headlines, his name linked to figures she had only dreamed of. The reporter reiterated my words. Because no child should learn they are too expensive to keep. The crowd applauded, but Rebecca heard only the echo of her own choices. The bracelet money in her hand felt like ashes. The man she had abandoned for being poor was now lauded as a benefactor by the world. And she realized with horror that wealth had been waiting in her own house the night she walked away. Rebecca stood rooted to the spot, the pawn shop's din fading into silence. On the screen my name scrolled across the ticker again and again. David Miller, billionaire philanthropist. Her lips parted but no sound emerged. The broke mechanic she'd mocked, the man she'd branded a failure, was now wealthier than Victor had ever been. More than that, respected, admired, applauded. Images flooded her mind. The emerald dress, the divorce papers slapped against my chest. Ethan crying at the door as she stepped into the Escalade. She had traded love for luxury and in the end lost both. The word billionaire hammered in her skull until it felt like a punishment. She gripped the counter to steady herself, cash still crumpled in her fist. For years, she had convinced herself she'd escaped a dead end. But now she saw the truth. She hadn't escaped. She had abandoned the very life she claimed she deserved. And there was no way to rewind. Envy and regret twisted inside Rebecca until she could barely breathe. Every headline, every news clip of me at that podium was a stab wound. The man she had discarded as dead was not only alive but thriving. And I was doing it all without her. That night, she dragged her suitcase to the airport, its wheels rattling like a confession. At the counter, she slid her last remaining bills across the glass, hands trembling. "One ticket to Dallas," she whispered. The clerk, oblivious to the storm raging in her eyes, simply printed the boarding pass. In the waiting area she scrolled through her phone, watching the same broadcast relentlessly. My face filled the screen, Ethan at my side, Sarah's hand on his shoulder. A family, a life, everything she had carelessly thrown away. Her jealousy curdled into a desperate resolve. If she could just see me, just plead her case, perhaps, just perhaps, she could force her way back in. She didn't comprehend that door had long since sealed shut. That same night, while Rebecca clutched her ticket to Dallas, I stood on a stage beneath bright floodlights at the grand opening of the Miller Trades Academy. The hall was packed. Students in new uniforms, veterans in the front row. Families holding back tears as they realized tuition would cost them nothing. Sarah stood beside me, grace and conviction in every glance, her hand steady in mine. Ethan, now taller and braver, wore a small suit that made him beam with pride. He tugged my sleeve and whispered, "Dad, they're cheering for you." I smiled and whispered back, "No, son. They're cheering for what we built." Applause thundered as I cut the ribbon. Cameras flashed, not for fame but for the promise of possibility. For the first time I allowed myself to fully absorb the weight of the moment. Not just an inheritance but a purpose fulfilled. And as confetti drifted across the stage, I was unaware that hundreds of miles away, Rebecca's plane was touching down. After the academy ceremony we drove home, tired but profoundly content. Ethan dozed in the back seat, Sarah leaning against me with quiet pride. The house smelled of the cinnamon rolls she had baked that morning. For a moment life felt perfectly ordinary. The kind of ordinary I once thought I'd never experience again. Then my phone buzzed on the counter. A message glowed across the screen, and my chest tightened as I read the words. "I'm in Dallas. I need to see you." The sender's name was one I hadn't seen in years, Rebecca. I stared at the screen, the room suddenly heavy with ghosts. Every memory flooded back. The rain, the emerald dress, Ethan crying at the door. She had vanished into another life. And now, after everything, she was back. I slowly set the phone down, my heart pounding. For the first time in 5 years, Rebecca was reaching out. And I knew this was only the beginning. I tried to ignore the first message, but my phone buzzed again. This time, the words were sharper, heavier. "I'm outside the gate." I walked to the window and pulled the curtain just enough to peer out. Headlights glowed at the end of the drive, illuminating the iron bars that shielded our home. A taxi idled, exhaust curling into the night. And there she was, Rebecca, standing in the beam of light, thinner, older, her suitcase handle clutched like an anchor. Behind me, Sarah was drying dishes. Ethan bent over his homework at the kitchen table. The warmth of our life filled the house. But outside, the storm I thought had passed was waiting, knocking with desperate hands. My pulse hammered. 5 years of silence. 5 years of building. And now the past stood at my gate, demanding entrance. I released the curtain and drew a long breath. It was time to face her. The gravel crunched beneath my boots as I walked down the long drive. The iron gate stood between us, tall and unyielding. Rebecca gripped her suitcase with one hand, the other clutching the bars as though sheer force could tear them apart. Her eyes glistened in the harsh glow of the taxi's headlights. Behind me, I felt Sarah and Ethan step onto the porch. They didn't retreat and I didn't ask them to. This was our life now, and it held no shadows. Ethan's small hand rested in Sarah's, steady as an anchor. Rebecca's voice cracked as she spoke. "David, I made a terrible mistake." Tears streamed fast, messy, nothing like the curated smile she'd once worn. "I was wrong about you, about everything. Please, for Liam's sake." She caught herself. "For Ethan's sake." The night held its breath. The gate hummed faintly, locked, immovable. I stared at her through the bars, the weight of the past pressing down. And then in the harsh beam of the taxi's headlights, I answered. I barely recognized her. Rebecca was thinner. Her once perfect figure swallowed by a wrinkled coat. Her hair, once meticulously styled, clung damply to her cheeks. The suitcase at her side was scuffed, its wheels squeaking when she shifted it. The kind you drag when you've exhausted all the grand lobbies to belong in. This was not the woman who had exited in an emerald dress, perfume trailing like a weapon. This was someone hollowed by choices, by years, by regret. She pressed her forehead against the cold iron bars, her voice trembling. "David, please let me in. I'll do anything. I just want a chance to be part of his life again." Her tears carved streaks through smeared makeup, her hands clutching the gate as if it could absolve her. I stood a few feet away, steadfast yet unyielding, the faces of Sarah and Ethan watching from the porch behind me, and finally I spoke. Rebecca's knees buckled and she sank onto the gravel, her old suitcase tipping beside her with a dull thud. Her hands trembled as she gripped the bars, her face streaked with tears that left dark trails through her makeup. "I was wrong," she sobbed, her voice raw, broken. "All of it. The money, the choices, leaving you, leaving him. Please, David, let me be his mother again. Just give me a chance to make it right." The words spilled out, fast and desperate, echoing against the still night air. For a fleeting moment I almost saw the woman I once loved. Fragile, lost, begging for a way back. But then I remembered the little boy in Superman pajamas crying at the door as she stepped into an Escalade without a backward glance. Behind me I felt Ethan shift, his small body tense, his eyes fixed on her. He took a step forward, Sarah's hand still hovering at his shoulder. And then for the very first time my son spoke. Ethan descended 2 steps, Sarah's hand still close enough to steady him if he wavered. But his voice held steady. It was thin, yes, but firm, clear as the ring of a hammer on steel. He looked directly at Rebecca, his eyes older than his 10 years. "You're the lady from my nightmares," he said, each word deliberate. "Sarah is my mom." The silence that followed was heavier than the gate itself. Rebecca froze, her mouth opening as if to protest, but no words came. Tears welled again, this time not cultivated but raw, ragged. I felt my chest tighten, pain for my son, who had carried that memory for so long, and a strange, sharp grief for the woman who had made herself a stranger. Rebecca's hand slipped from the bars, falling into her lap. For the first time she looked smaller than Ethan, broken beneath the weight of the truth a child had just uttered. Rebecca's strength gave out, and she crumpled onto the gravel, palms scraped, shoulders shaking as sobs tore through her. The suitcase tipped onto its side, spilling worn clothes and a pair of heels far past their prime. She didn't reach for them. She only pressed her hands against the ground like a penitent at an altar. Her voice emerged jagged, desperate. "I don't want your money, David," she cried, shaking her head so hard that strands of hair clung to her wet cheeks. "I only want my son. Please just let me be his mother again. I'll live anywhere. I'll do anything. I just want him back." The night swallowed her words, but their echo reached Ethan, who stood frozen, Sarah's hand still steady on his shoulder. My chest tightened, not from temptation, but from grief at what she had become. I stepped closer, my voice low but firm, carrying the weight of all these years. "Punishment isn't our work. Protection is." Rebecca lifted her tear-streaked face, eyes wild with desperation, clinging to Ethan's name as though it could force the gate open. That's when I finally spoke, steady and unflinching. "Don't use his name as a key," I said, my voice low but sharp enough to cut through her sobs. "Punishment isn't our work. Protection is." The words hung in the night air, heavy and undeniable. Behind me, Sarah tightened her hand on Ethan's shoulder, not in fear, but in quiet affirmation. Our son leaned closer to her, choosing safety without hesitation. Rebecca pressed her forehead against the iron bars, whispering brokenly, "Please, just once, let me in." But the gate remained shut, its hum steady, a silent reminder that some doors once closed, never reopen. From the shadows a security guard appeared, keeping his distance but ready. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The truth had already sealed itself in stone. The gate stood firm, humming with quiet power, refusing to move. Rebecca's hand slipped from the cold iron, falling limp at her sides. Her sobs shook the night, echoing off the stone pillars, but the lock never yielded. The security guard stepped forward gently, as if approaching a wounded animal. "Ma'am," he said softly, "let me call you a cab." She resisted for a moment, clutching her battered suitcase, then nodded, defeated. The taxi door creaked open under the porch light. Rebecca staggered to her feet, her clothes dusty from the gravel, her dignity as fragile as glass. She looked at me one last time, eyes swollen, lips trembling with words she no longer possessed the strength to speak. I didn't gloat. I didn't turn away in anger. I simply stood steady with Sarah and Ethan behind me. The door shut. The taxi rolled into the darkness, and the night was quiet again, save for the steady sound of my son's breathing. When the taxi's taillights vanished, I turned from the gate and walked back toward the porch. Sarah and Ethan waited there, not questioning, not pushing, just standing steady in the glow of the porch light. My son's small arms wrapped around my waist before I reached the steps. Sarah's hand rested on my shoulder, warm and grounding. Inside, the house welcomed us with its familiar scent. Cinnamon from Sarah's rolls cooling on the counter, motor oil lingering from a garage project. It was imperfect, patched and scratched in places, but it was profoundly ours. I pulled Ethan close, kissed the top of his head, then drew Sarah into my other arm. For the first time that night, my chest eased, the storm outside replaced by the hum of safety within these walls. True wealth wasn't waiting at gates or printed in headlines. It was here in the warmth of this modest house, with the people who chose to stay. As I sat at the kitchen table that night, Ethan's laughter echoing from the garage and Sarah humming softly over dishes, I realized something the world often overlooks. True wealth isn't a jet awaiting on the tarmac. It isn't a check with too many zeros to count. It isn't the applause of strangers or a headline proclaiming you a billionaire. True wealth is the people who stand by you when the storm rages, the ones who build beside you when recognition is scarce, the arms that wrap around you in silence and remind you that you are never alone. Rebecca had pursued money and lost everything. I had been left with nothing, yet found more than I ever imagined. So, I ask you, if you were in my position, would you have given her a second chance? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more true-to-life stories that remind us what truly matters.